Let me say it straight away, Jihlava Zoo is a very interesting park that surprised me quite a lot. Located in a rather narrow river valley, it's a relatively small zoo with only 9 hectares in size. And yet over 250 animal species, small and large, live here, including some curiosities. And even if many of the enclosures are, as expected, somewhat small, the way the park makes the most of the cramped space for the animals is at least partly remarkable. But before we get in there, let me know in the comments down below, have you been to Jihlava Zoo before, or have you at least heard about it? And what are your thoughts or expectations? Honestly, I didn't know what to expect because we traveled here relatively spontaneously. We decided to forego our planned third day at Prague Zoo, and boy oh boy am I glad that we did so. As this bridge was closed here, we actually entered the zoo through a side entrance, but in keeping with the usual visitor experience, we are going to start at the actual main entrance anyway, and here you will realize immediately that this zoo is at least partly really modern. Beyond the entrance plaza, we are welcomed by the meerkats, who as crowd favorites obviously make for a great reception committee. But I was more taken with the overall view because their enclosure here is beautifully embedded in an African area. As usual, its centerpiece is a savanna enclosure where the 2 giraffes certainly get the most attention. But there are also marabou storks, nylechwees, and nyalas, which also had a cute youngster to marvel at. The zebras, on the other hand, could be seen in a separate area. And yes, obviously, these are not the biggest savanna enclosures I've ever seen, and the giraffes in particular do not have the largest roaming space here, as parts of the enclosure are rightfully not accessible to them as a retreat for the other species. However, the enclosure are well structured and designed with the animals in mind, even if I have to praise the area as a whole primarily for the visitor experience. Because while I'm not sure if the animals can appreciate it as well, I'm sure you will all agree with me, especially with the view in the background. This place is simply beautiful. It's a sight that almost oozes the vibe of a postcard motif. Here in the lower area there is somewhat unfittingly an enclosure for Shetland ponies, while above the savanna enclosure there are well-equipped aviaries for African monkeys. Here you will find king colobuses that are already a quite unusual sight, even though we only just saw them in Rhenen, but currently you only get to see them in 12 European zoos in total. You also don't get to see black-crested mangabeys a lot, and still Lowe's Mona monkeys are an even bigger rarity. Here in the Czech Republic you also get to see them at Dvůr Králové, but otherwise you'll have to try La Palma or Ghana. But yeah, they almost look like vervet monkeys, so this will probably only be really appreciated by zoo or animal nerds. You can also enter the giraffe and antelope stable house, where I discovered the cute Kirkstick dicks. Furthermore, sand cats and desert cats also live here, and let me tell you, they are just the first taste of a truly remarkable collection of cat species. But at least it seems that they don't have any outdoor enclosures here, and as an indoor-only enclosure, I find this questionable. For better or worse, I'm used to that with nocturnal animals. There's just no other way if you reverse the day and night cycle. But as you can see already, the enclosures here are quite bright, and so it was a bit easier to get some usable shots of Senegal galagos and Carnet's crater galagos, as well as white-tailed rats and Malagasy giant rats. Last but not least, this African area is completed by another really beautiful enclosure for striped hyenas. And yes, they are another species that you don't get to see in every zoo. And so it must be said, from a visitor's point of view, this is a really promising introduction to the zoo. The area is part of Jihlava Zoo's largest modernization project to date, which goes by the name the 5 Continents Zoo and was launched in 2011 and completed in 2015 with the Tropical Pavilion, which we will come back to later. However, the Australian farm that now follows was also part of the project, which was only possible thanks to EU funding of around 82 million Czech crowns, that's roughly 3.3 million euros. You probably expect an area called Australian Farm to simply have, well, farm animals, but once again, the farmhouse alone contains an interesting collection of animals. For example, there are a few species of birds that thankfully also have outdoor aviaries. Most notable are the Australian magpies, which you can only find in 7 zoos in all of Europe. But then there are also small mammals like the bush-tailed bitong or sugar gliders, which are probably named after the German phrase zuckersüß, which translates to sugar cute. Long-nosed porteroos are another rarity, at least in mainland Europe, while in the UK they are quite common for some reason. The same cannot be said about kovaris, they don't have any of them, and there are overall just 8 zoos in Europe that have them. Beyond the farmhouse itself, there is also obviously a kangaroo enclosure, which is a must in every Australian area, and emus are also usually part of the package. But here in this enclosure live brush-tailed possums, which are once again much rarer to see, but I was able to cope with the fact that they didn't show themselves here because we had already seen them a few days earlier in Pilsen. From here the path leads into a forest area, past an enclosure for cassowaries, while here you could theoretically see bush dogs, and with that we have left Australia behind. But if we were to continue along the forest nature trail here, we would skip a good part of the zoo. And I definitely mean good in the sense of quantity, because it's actually probably the worst part of the zoo. This enclosure for pygmy hippos already suggests that we have left the modern part of the zoo for the time being, but apart from the somewhat plain appearance, this enclosure would perhaps still be okay in itself, but there are 2 of these solitary animals living here, and if one of them has to stay indoor in this ugly little shed. Well, I mean, do I even need to comment on that? That's horrible. Opposite this little horror show, a new enclosure was still being built during our visit. However, by now the rollaway monkeys have probably already moved in here, and I can obviously only judge it from this building site, but for a new enclosure it looks to be rather mediocre. I don't want to get too negative here, so let me tell you this. All the enclosures for South American animals here are quite acceptable, nothing to write home about, but enclosures like this one for collared peccaries are decent enough. And I really like the theming of this Pueblo house, which mainly houses marmosets. Living here are black-chested mustached tamarins, golden lion tamarins, silver marmosets, black-penciled marmosets, and also greater guinea pigs and poison dart frogs. Yes, of course, you could do without 1 or 2 species in terms of space, but it seemed to me that the combination of indoor and outdoor enclosures are still quite acceptable. Unfortunately, the predator house is rather old-fashioned again. This applies in particular to the indoor enclosures, where at least the outdated look is more disturbing to the visitors than the large and small cats that live here. But still, a predator house that looks like this is a stark contrast to all the modern enclosures we've seen before, and quite frankly, it's just no longer up to date. In addition, there are simply a lot of animals living here. There are once again desert cats and Palawan leopard cats, which you can find 3 times in the Czech Republic, but otherwise only in a zoo in Hungary. Then there is a serval, Sri Lankan leopards and a Sumatran tiger. That's a lot considering this house is rather small, and the outdoor enclosures aren't exactly spacious either. It's particularly bad for the desert and leopard cats, which also have to live in small glass boxes outside. This is the quite narrow enclosure for the serval. I mean, I guess I've seen worse, but this is still not great. The leopard's enclosure is at least covered with a net and can therefore offer some climbing opportunities and can score a few points with its verticality. And they also definitely tried to pack everything a tiger needs into this small enclosure. This here is a small pool, for example, better than nothing. But let's be real here, this limited space is an issue. Yes, I know most experts will tell you that space isn't the most important thing, but for a good structure, setup and the possibility of keeping the animals reasonably occupied with enrichment, you need a certain amount of floor space. And I don't think that's enough here. So yeah, this predator area really needs urgent reworking in pretty much every aspect, or should simply be demolished. But I think the people in charge at Jihlava Zoo know that too, so I just hope that sooner rather than later the financial resources will be found to bring this area up to the modern standards of the rest of the zoo. The most pragmatic and cheapest solution would probably be to concentrate entirely on leopards and perhaps one of the small cat species, put up more nets, remodel all the outdoor enclosures. That still wouldn't be pretty and shiny, but it would be acceptable. If necessary, you also have to give up popular animals sometimes, as happened with the harbor seals a few years ago. This is their old enclosure, which was only home to a presumably injured swan when we visited. One article I read said that giant otters were supposed to move in here, but instead, if I understood correctly, small clawed otters have now moved in. If you can confirm or correct this, please let me know in the comments. Fortunately, the rest of the zoo has already been completely modernized. And as you can see here as an example, most of it is really beautifully designed. This also applies to this area, where we were greeted by a Caucasian leopard when we arrived through the side entrance. Yes, that's right, a second species of leopard. In addition, snow leopards and red pandas are also living here in really beautifully designed and well-equipped enclosures, all of which are covered by nets. But as beautiful and modern as these enclosures may seem in contrast to the old predators enclosures, they are not much bigger. And the same is true for these small cat facilities. Caracals and palace cats live here, both of which I always enjoy seeing, and the even rarer jungle cats also live here, as well as European wildcats, which didn't show. But that's okay, I was very pleased to be able to film the other species so well. So yeah, as already announced, the cat population is insane. But again, is it really necessary to keep 4 species in this limited area? Wouldn't 2 have been enough, or maybe even just 1? I mean, yes, the enclosures and the viewing options are beautifully designed, but that shouldn't gloss over the small size of it all. However, we now come to an enclosure complex that clearly shows how to get the maximum out of a limited space with a well thought out concept. In the center of it all is this house with aviaries on both sides. They are home to yellow-checked gibbons. Their indoor enclosures are quite vertical, and if you climb these stairs, you can also look into them from the attic. The real kicker, however, is that an enclosure for babirusas has been created around the aviaries, and as you can see, it partly just looks like a moat. And while the result is of course not a huge enclosure, I still think it's a really effective use of the limited space available. This complex is also home to another rarity. These are the only Philippine palm civets in the Czech Republic, and in the whole of Europe, these viverrids can only be seen in 4 other facilities. Right next to this complex, there are enclosures for white-nosed coatis, as well as Visayan warty pigs, one of the most endangered wild pig species. There's also this rather large and beautiful pond housing some waterfowl, and this walk-in aviary with some more birds, for example scarlet ibises. The next area we will talk about in more detail is the Tropical Pavilion. As already mentioned, it was completed in 2015 and concluded the Zoo of 5 Continents project. With construction costs of 43 million Czech crowns, or around 1.7 million euros, it was also the most expensive and complex new building of this project. And I have to say, even at first glance, the round shape of the building alone makes it architecturally very interesting. From the outside, you can see through glass facades into indoor enclosures for crocodile monitors and white-faced sakis, which unfortunately have no outdoor enclosures. Inside the building, the path leads past numerous terrariums, which are designed like small caves, and here you will find mainly reptiles such as other monitor lizards, various snakes, Lau-banded iguanas, frilled lizards, pink-tongued skinks, or Oriental bearded anole, which you can otherwise only see in Moscow. On the lower level, the path also leads past a riverbed, where you can find the Siamese crocodiles, perhaps the most iconic inhabitants of this house. Dwarf crocodiles also live here, as well as various fish and freshwater turtles. On the upper level, however, the path leads over a bridge through the center of the indoor jungle. From here you can look back down on the crocodiles, and you will probably also come across the black-turfed marmosets, which roam the house freely. However, I found the monkeys' suspicious scrutiny of the rubbish bin a little bit worrying. I mean, visitors' rubbish would hardly be the best food for them. All in all, there is really a lot to discover here, and the house is also very well designed with lots of nice details. For example, there is a crashed aeroplane embedded in the jungle, inside which you can find green basilisks. Some of the terrariums could be a little bit bigger, but as far as I can tell, they are expertly designed and furnished, so it somehow fits in perfectly with the overall impression of the zoo so far. The South American enclosure neighboring the house is a welcome exception, because even though I wouldn't call it huge, I also wouldn't describe it as small. It's not just capybaras living here, but also lowland tapirs, which prefer to stay in their stable. On the other side of the Tropical Pavilion is an enclosure for sun bears. The only other place in the Czech Republic where you can see them is in Ústí nad Labem, a zoo we will also be checking out very soon. As you can already see, here in Jihlava, the enclosure is beautifully laid out on a slope and actually makes quite a good impression, at least at first glance. You can look into the enclosure through a glass window or get an overview from an elevated level. Here you can also clearly see that although many tree trunks have been placed in the enclosure, they are all more or less lying on the ground. However, sun bears like to climb, as you can see here at Burger Zoo Arnhem, for example. You should therefore definitely offer your sun bears real climbing opportunities, and this enclosure should be big enough for some climbing structures in the middle, so the lack thereof is somewhat baffling and bizarre. There is also an enclosure for wolves here on the slope, which looks very natural because it's located in a forest area. And once again there is a lookout here, but it's a little too low to see completely over the fence. And as there weren't enough cats to see already, there are also actually lynxes living here. However, the enclosure was not completely fenced in during our visit and therefore not occupied. We have now explored almost the entire zoo, but there is definitely something for the eye at the end, with some beautiful lemur islands and a colony of flamingos. Ring-tailed lemurs, of course, can be found in almost every other zoo. Red-ruffed lemurs are also very well represented, but there are also black lemurs, for example. I almost overlooked the biggest rarity in this house. This cute animal is a good man's mouse lemur, which you can only find in 8 zoos in the whole of Europe. Behind the flamingo colony, which also had a few chicks, there is an African-style village, and in addition to a petting zoo enclosure, you can also discover Rodriguez fruit beds in one of the huts. Of course, no zoo is complete without a large playground. And at the very end there are some Czech treasures to see, specifically a few local breeds of domestic animals, such as these cute and curious rabbits. And that's it. I left out a few little things here and there, but I've shown you most of it. And I think you agree with me, that was a lot, especially for a medium-sized zoo. And even though there is also an older area that doesn't measure up, most of the zoo makes a really nice modern impression. And yes, they managed to make the most of the limited space in some areas, but I still have very mixed feelings in the end. Of course, the zoo is also attractive to visitors because of the wealth of species, but in my opinion, a different compromise should have been found for the sake of the animals. For example, do we really need to have so many cat species living here? Even the modern areas could have offered so much more for the animals if they had focused on one species instead of 2 or 3. I mean, it's not all bad. I thought many of the animal enclosures were absolutely fine, but all in all, it's just a bit too much for the space available. And that's a shame, because apart from that, Jihlava Zoo is for the most part a really beautiful park that is well worth seeing. So don't get me wrong, it's not a bad zoo, and if you're ever in Jihlava, I can definitely recommend a visit. But yeah, unfortunately, this zoo is also an example of how you won't quite achieve the optimum compromise between species richness, visitor attractiveness, and the best possible animal welfare. At least that's how I see it, but of course you can disagree with me in the comments. What is your impression of Jihlava Zoo? Have you already been there, or would you like to visit after watching this video? Let me know in the comments down below, and if you liked the video, please give it a thumbs up, and of course subscribe if you want to continue to accompany me on my journey through the world of zoos. I've also visited 4 more zoos in the Czech Republic last year, and this year I'm already planning another trip through the Czech Republic and also Poland this time, so there's definitely a lot to look forward to here. This will be an exciting year. Until then, thank you very much for your attention, take care, tak za tím, or as we say in Germany, auf Wiedersehen, yours truly, Martin.